Do politicians follow science in regard to GMOs?
Mostly no, but that's because too many scientists are not following science on GMOs either, and the politicians are influenced by what they hear from influential scientists. So the main problem, as my book Altered Genes, Twisted Truth has demonstrated, is the misbehavior of the scientific community when it comes to this issue. And if eminent scientists and scientific institutions had actually followed science, if they had acted in a responsible manner and told the truth, clearly communicated the truth instead of systematically twisting the truth, then politicians would not have allowed GMOs on the market anywhere.
Have the benefits and risks of genetically modified foods been accurately portrayed to the public by the media?
Unfortunately, no. They've been inaccurately portrayed. And again, for primarily the same reason, is that the politicians have been misled and have not acted in accord with science. The authoritative spokespeople and authoritative institutions from the fields of science, when it comes to GMOs, have not been communicating accurately. And that certainly, if they're not communicating accurately, then the media certainly will not. However, I should add that the media has exacerbated the problem by suppressing key evidence that's been given to them. And my book documents several shocking incidents. I have firsthand information about this because a lawsuit that I organized that forced the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to divulge its internal files on genetically engineered foods brought out that the FDA had been lying. We found out that the FDA politically appointed administrators were saying one thing in public, but their scientists had been saying another thing in their memos, warning them about the inherent dangers, the inherent risks of the genetic engineering process, and cautioning that genetic engineering is very different than traditional breeding in terms of its risks, and that none of the foods can be presumed to be safe unless and until it has passed rigorous safety testing. And unfortunately, the Food and Drug Administration has had, beginning with the presidential administration of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, had adopted a promotional policy. It had actually been given a promotional policy by the Reagan White House to promote the U.S. biotechnology industry and to do whatever it could to speed the introduction of these crops onto the U.S. and world markets. I should say whatever it could, obviously within the limits of the law. However, the FDA actually went beyond that mandate and broke the law in pushing GMOs on the market. My book documents that. But it's very clear cut that the scientists informed the FDA administrators repeatedly about the abnormal risks of genetically engineered foods. But in the 1992 policy statement that the FDA issued, which is still in effect, they stated that they were not aware of any information showing that crops produced by genetic engineering differ from other crops in any meaningful or uniform way. That's a blatant lie, unless you don't consider memoranda from your own scientists as to be information. And unless, like the FDA, you basically only count on misinformation being information. And unfortunately, it's the misinformation dispensed by the Food and Drug Administration, by eminent scientists and scientific institutions, that is passed as scientific information. So unfortunately, we and the media, getting back to the question, I have given reporters for leading newspapers and news magazines concrete evidence of the irrefutable evidence that the FDA is lying, that they are claiming one thing and their scientists said another. They're also claiming that there's an overwhelming consensus within the scientific community that genetically engineered foods are safe, whereas their own files show they knew back in 1991, just before they brought out the statement, they knew that there was not a scientific consensus outside the FDA either. They clearly knew, and their files demonstrate, that to the extent there was consensus within the FDA scientific staff, the consensus was genetically engineered foods entail unique risks and must be rigorously tested, each one of them rigorously tested, before it's allowed on the market. So they knew that there was not a consensus these foods were safe, and yet they claimed that also. And that false claim of consensus continues to be the sole legal basis for the FDA's policy and the presence of GMOs on the US market.
Why did you write the book, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth?
To untwist the truth. The truth has been twisted so badly for so long, ever since really the first genetically engineered bacterium was created. And that was back in the early 1970s. The scientists who were promoting and advancing genetic engineering were so concerned that there would be intervention by public interest attorneys like myself, by bioethicists, by other scientists who had a more holistic vision of biology than they did. Most of them did not have a general holistic vision of biology. They were concerned that ecologists would get involved and put the brakes on what they were doing, because they were planning to release a lot of very dangerous organisms into the environment. And the ecologists were warning about that. So they wanted to shut out outside influences and keep the molecular biologists who were doing genetic engineering in control of the process. They said, we'll regulate ourselves. We will police ourselves. But they didn't do a very good job of that. What they did do a good job of was spinning the facts and often distorting and downright lying about the facts. And the distortions, the spin, the distortions, the misinformation accumulated and accelerated as genetic engineering advanced into agriculture. It's not well known, but even though the claims from the proponents of genetic engineering are that it's very simple and we can now move any genes at will between species, between biological kingdoms, it was actually very difficult to do that. Several very strong biological barriers had to be broken down, and breaking down the barriers on moving plant DNA into bacteria was one thing. That was hard enough. But moving bacterial DNA into plants was much harder. And it was more than 9 years from the creation of the first genetically engineered bacterium before the first simplest genetically engineered plant was created, let alone the more complex crops, agricultural crops. So trying to create genetically engineered crops was very difficult. As my book demonstrates, several natural barriers had to be broken down. It was very difficult. Genes had to be rewritten. Bacterial genes had to be substantially reconfigured before they would function within a plant. They don't tell you this. They just say it's simple, there's a simple natural extension. That isn't the case. So the truth has been so systematically and dramatically twisted over all these years. I wanted to untwist it in a very comprehensive way, to systematically untwist it, and that's why I wrote the book, to get the facts out there. And the book, slowly but surely, is having an effect within the scientific community and the academic community generally. And when there are enough people of influence that know the facts and understand the extent to which they and others have been hoodwinked, there can be major changes.
When the FDA issued its policy in May of 1992, it asserted there was an overwhelming consensus among scientists that GE foods are so safe they don't require any testing. Was this true?
No, it's not true. And a lawsuit that I initiated against the FDA, which forced that agency to hand over more than 44,000 pages of its internal files on genetically engineered foods, demonstrates that statement is not true, that claim is not true. because it shows that the the overwhelming consensus among the FDA's own scientific expert staff is that genetic engineering is very different than conventional breeding, and it entails higher risks, and that all of its foods have to be carefully tested, rigorously tested, before they're put on the market and fed to the population. And it also showed that the FDA itself knew that there was not a scientific consensus about safety within the scientific community outside the FDA, the general scientific community. In fact, one of the letters I found, one of the most damning documents I found within the FDA's files, was a letter from the FDA's biotechnology coordinator to a Canadian health official admitting that there was not a consensus about about safety within the scientific community. And yet, about 7 months after that letter was written, the FDA came out with that policy claiming there was an overwhelming consensus. Outright lie. Sacrificing the truth to enable the GMO venture to advance while sacrificing responsible regulation and imposing serious risks on the population, risks that its own scientists had warned about. I can't think actually of a bigger governmental fraud than that one, at least not within a Western democracy. Can think of some within Stalinist Russia or, the Third Reich, but within a modern Western democracy, that may rank as the worst governmental fraud.
Have they currently a scientific consensus that genetically engineered foods are safe?
No, there has never been a scientific consensus that GMOs are safe. As I noted, the FDA's biotechnology manager wrote a letter to a Canadian health official in the fall of 1991 conceding that there was not a consensus about safety then, and there's never been one since. And in fact, several eminent scientific organizations have issued cautionary statements. Now, the claims that come out from the biotech promoters are that there's an overwhelming consensus of safety. In fact, in 2012, the board of directors of the American Association for the Advancement of Science released a statement claiming, among other falsehoods, that that every respected scientific organization that has reviewed the data has come to the same conclusion, that genetically engineered foods are no riskier than conventional foods. But that's not an accurate statement. In fact, in 2001, the Royal Society of Canada, that nation's premier scientific body, came out with a major report in which they stated that the default prediction for every genetically engineered food should be that the genetic engineering process has created at least one or more unintended side effects, some of which could be harmful to the health of the ultimate consumer. They also stated it's scientifically unjustifiable to presume that any genetically engineered food is safe unless it has gone through a battery of rigorous tests that were far more rigorous than the Canadian regulators were requiring at the time, far more rigorous than the FDA has ever come close to requiring, and more rigorous than any regulators anywhere in the world were or have since required. So if the guidelines of the Canadian report had been followed, there wouldn't be any genetically engineered foods on the market right now, or any that were on the market would have passed a much stricter, more rigorous battery of tests. So that's the state. Also, the British Medical Society has come out with cautions. The Public Health Association of Australia, beginning in the year 2000, has released report after report showing, cautioning about the risks, explaining the risks, criticizing the regulatory agencies for not paying attention to the science and to the risks, and for allowing very shoddy safety tests to be done by the manufacturers in order to gain approval for their foods and get them onto dinner plates of Australians and Americans and Canadians. It's really quite astounding what's been going on. In the name of science, under the banner of science, science has been perverted and subverted.
Now that we know all of that, is there a consensus at the FDA that GE foods are safe?
Well, the scientists at the FDA, to the extent we have documentation on their opinion, their consensus was they can't be presumed safe, either as a class or individually, and each one, in fact, must be presumed to entail abnormal risks and have its safety verified by rigorous testing, which, by the way, is what the U.S. food safety law also requires. Most people don't know that. The U.S. food safety law on the books is very strict, and that strict law applies to GMOs, genetically engineered foods. In our lawsuit, the FDA conceded that, and they had conceded it back in their 1992 policy statement, that the laws, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, as it was amended in 1958 to cover food additives, that these new DNA constructs that are being put into various grains and fruits and vegetables would qualify as food additives that are presumed unsafe and have to be tested and demonstrated safe unless they are generally recognized as safe. That's why they claim there's an overwhelming consensus, because they need to claim that in order to state that these foods, basically according to law, can be on the market without requiring any testing. The FDA does not require one iota of testing. Now, in public, they claim they are, and biotech proponents always state, oh no, these foods have to go through rigorous review with the FDA. Poppycock. That is not true at all. Now, the FDA did set up a procedure for voluntary consultation, but the internal documents that the lawsuit I initiated forced out of their files shows that was set up to basically give the illusion that there was regulation, while also giving the manufacturers free rein to do whatever they wanted. So it's all voluntary. In fact, a significant proportion of the GMO foods on the market have not even gone through the voluntary consultation. But scientists who've actually studied what's going on said, it's a joke, because the FDA accepts whatever the manufacturers, the Monsantos, the DuPonts tell them, and they rubber stamp it. And in fact, the biotechnology coordinator, manager for the FDA, even in writing once admitted that process is not a scientific review. Because for one thing, the FDA doesn't require original data. So he said it's not a scientific review. But in public, the FDA claims it is. So it's just part of the massive fraud through which genetically engineered foods have entered the market. The FDA, it bears repeating and it bears emphasizing, the FDA has been misrepresenting the facts, lying about the extent of scientific consensus, covering up the fact that to the extent they know of consensus within their own ranks, among their own scientists, the consensus was overwhelmingly that GMOs entail abnormal risks. And they've been breaking the food safety law to boot. They're lying and they're breaking our law, and to date they've been getting away with it. Again, that's another reason I wrote my book, so that they no longer will be able to get away with it. And when enough people of influence and goodwill and integrity have read my book, they won't be able to get away with it.
So it's clear what you're saying is there's no rigorous testing on each crop.
No rigorous testing
FDA
has been required in the United States or Canada, and even though there has been some testing required in the European Union and some other countries, it has not been at the level of rigor that independent scientists have said, who understand what the genetic engineering process is and the unique risks it imposes, the abnormal risks that it imposes. They have called for testing much stricter than has been imposed by any regulatory body. And it's interesting that up until 2013, even the EU, the European Union, did not require testing, safety testing with the whole food. That only became required in 2013, but even then, the European Union only required medium-term 90-day tests, and many experts have called for much longer-term testing than that, and there's good reason for that. And the experts who wrote the Royal Society of Canada's report in 2001 emphasized that there needed to be long-term testing not only on animals, but then human clinical trials, as in the case of drugs. Nobody's required that. So again, according to many experts, including Canada's premier scientific body, no genetically engineered food on the market has gone through a series of tests rigorous enough to basically give us any confidence about its safety.
Regulators outside of the United States have allowed GE foods to gain approval through the concept of substantial equivalence, an approach that the Royal Society of Canada has declared to be scientifically unjustifiable. Can you explain what this concept is, who uses it, and why the Canadian experts criticized it so strongly?
Yes, the concept of substantial equivalence is not substantially scientific, as the Canadian experts emphasized in their report, and as many other scientists who are not promoting GMOs have recognized and have clearly stated themselves. It's basically, in fact, several scientists have, as have the Canadian experts, as have several other scientists have shown, it's a very loose standard. It's so amorphous that basically almost anything could count. So it hasn't ever been, there haven't been clear scientific criteria for it. Basically, it allows superficial analyses of a GMO to be made. And then to say, well, if superficially, although they don't say it's superficial, if the GMO, for instance, appears to be substantially equivalent to its non-genetically engineered counterpart, for instance, if a genetically engineered potato seems to have similar characteristics to conventional potatoes, and a chemical analysis shows that basically it looks like it's chemically somewhat similar, but without going into detailed analysis to see if there have been any new toxins or any new allergens, then we'll say it's substantially equivalent. It doesn't really have to go through any further testing, and it can be marketed. And many genetically engineered foods were allowed on the market through that concept because it was holding sway in Canada, still is essentially the main regulatory, concept in Canada. In the European Union, it was up until 2013 that the concept of substantial equivalence was the main avenue through which genetically engineered foods were being approved. It was only consumer resistance that were keeping those foods off the market, not the European Commission. They were approving these foods. In Australia, again, substantial equivalence was the primary, and I think still is the primary rubric through which genetically engineered foods are assessed and by and large approved. Now, in the United States, it's worse. Even though the substantial equivalence is a very loose, unscientific way to analyze requirement, in the US, there wasn't even that. The FDA does not require one iota of testing, and it imposes no mandatory burden on Monsanto, DuPont, and other manufacturers of genetically engineered food. So in the US, any manufacturer can dump any genetically engineered food on our market, not only without testing it, not only without even putting it through the analysis of, well, can it be considered substantially equivalent to conventional crops? It doesn't even have to inform the Food and Drug Administration that it is putting a GMO on the market. So not one shred of requirement imposed by the U.S. government when it comes to food safety, by the FDA, on any manufacturer of genetically engineered food. And yet they claim that they're putting these foods through a rigorous review process. That is an utter falsehood. And it's really just shameful that the FDA continues to make that claim and to get away with it with the assistance of eminent scientists and scientific institutions who should know better and perhaps do know better, but continue to parrot the FDA's fraudulent claim as well.
What about the claim that traditional breeding is just as likely to generate novel toxins as is the process of creating new plants through genetic engineering?
That's another claim that is scientifically unsound and demonstrably false. And that claim has been made by eminent institutions. In fact, let me give you an example of how bogus this claim is. Okay, the 2004 report by the United States National Academies of Science, put out through the National Research Council. I believe it was put out through the council, but anyway, this is a report from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. It was at the time claimed to be the gold standard of risk assessments, but as it's analyzed, if one actually does analyze it, as my book does, it's found to be full of flaws, logical inconsistencies, and a lot of surreptitious shenanigans going on. Let me give you, and one of the biggest and worst, was in regard to this claim that, well, the risks of unintended novel toxins are just as great in conventionally produced crops as in genetically engineered crops. So, they made that claim, but then they had to try to back it up. They couldn't back it up with any good evidence. For one thing, they cited several examples of foods where they said new toxins were created, but actually they were just examples where toxins that are found in that species anyway have been elevated through conventional breeding. But they could only cite a few examples: potatoes and celery, I think maybe one tomato. But again, they weren't novel toxins that were being shown. It was elevation of toxins that breeders have known about for a long time. In fact, when it comes to those crops, to those species, they monitor for those levels. That's how they found that there were elevated levels. Then they went on to claim, well, there actually is one example, a potato, where crossing a wild variety of the potato with a domesticated variety of the potato led to the production of a toxin that was not produced in either parent. And then again, a little later in the report, they stated that toxin, domesticidine, was novel to both parents. That's an outright fabrication. It's a falsehood, because domesticidine is produced in almost every potato as potatoes develop and mature. Now, the thing that was different in the genetically engineered potato, in that particular conventional potato, was that domesticidine was still present in the mature, ripened potato. That was unusual. That isn't the case in any edible potato, or it will be inedible. But it wasn't novel. It wasn't a toxin that had never been produced in either parent, like they claimed. And again, it was found because potatoes are checked for domesticidine. Now, if that had been a truly novel toxin, they wouldn't have even known to check for it, because it wouldn't have been in potatoes before. And in fact, we know that genetic engineering could produce toxins that not only have never been in the food before, but perhaps never been on Earth before. That's why the scientists at the FDA and the Royal Society of Canada and many other independent bodies have warned that that's why GMOs need to be carefully tested, because they could contain toxins or allergens that have never been before seen in that species. And it could be at very low levels too, but still harmful. We know that. So that's why the independent experts, like the experts at the Royal Society of Canada, have cautioned about the risks and have called for rigorous testing, because only the testing, that rigorous testing with the whole food, feeding it to animals and then ultimately to humans, could give us great enough confidence that there hasn't been some novel toxin or allergen created in that food. And the claim that there's just as great a risk through traditional breeding as through genetic engineering of novel toxins being created is bunk. It just is bunk masquerading as science.
What about the oft-repeated claim that no ingestible product of genetic engineering has ever been linked to a human health problem?
That again is a false claim. In fact, the very first ingestible product of genetic engineering, which was a food supplement of the essential amino acid L-tryptophan, which we need, it caused a major epidemic in North America, especially in the United States. It seriously sickened, that food supplement that was produced through genetically engineered bacteria, seriously sickened around 5,000 people, perhaps even more, and it killed dozens. Also, hundreds of those people are still physically impaired, seriously impaired, invalids, many of them, just from taking a supplement. Now, as I mentioned, that was the very first ingestible product of genetic engineering. It caused a major epidemic, killed a lot of people. So, and we know it was linked. The evidence shows, the epidemiological evidence shows, that epidemic was linked to only to the supplements that were created through genetic engineering. For many years, L-tryptophan supplements were created using bacteria, the same strain that had been used in creating the genetically engineered bacteria. They hadn't caused any problem. And then one of the manufacturers got the bright idea, well, you know, if we use genetic engineering to endow the bacteria with extra copies of some of the genes, their genes that are involved in synthesizing bacteria, because unlike human beings, these bacteria can synthesize L-tryptophan. That's why we humans need to get it from our diet, or if we're deficient in it, supplement it. And so all they did, see, this wasn't even a case of foreign genes being put into the bacteria. Bacteria were just given extra copies of their own genes, and it created an unusual illness, an unusual toxic contamination. And the best evidence, the best evidence we have, the evidence as a whole, strongly points to the genetic engineering process as the cause of the unusual toxic contaminant or contaminants that were found that exist in that product and that caused the epidemic. Okay. It wasn't L-tryptophan itself that caused the problem. It was adulterated, contaminated L-tryptophan, and the best evidence indicates that it was the genetic engineering of the bacteria that caused them their metabolism to become destabilized, caused them to be stressed in a way that unusual and highly toxic contaminant was created, or contaminants. Now, so anyway, that answers that question very strongly. Yes, there has been a link between a genetically engineered product and a human food, human disease. And to claim there hasn't is not only false, but shameful. And it's only because that epidemic, the facts about that epidemic were so badly suppressed and distorted by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, by many supposedly responsible scientists, that GMOs were able to actually then get on the market. If they'd faced the facts, then there would have been much stricter precautions. And unfortunately for them, for the industry, it probably would have killed the whole thing right then and there, because the imposition of real, truly rigorous testing requirements would have been very difficult for the industry to economically and politically bear. And that's why that epidemic, most people were probably hearing about it for the first time, unless they've read my book or one of the books by other people who understand the facts. And I've talked to several public health officials who don't even know about that epidemic. That's how badly the facts have been twisted and suppressed.
In fact, no regulators require tests of genetically engineered foods greater than 90 days. Is that right?
That's right. And in the U.S., there's no tests required at all. In Canada, they haven't imposed the 90-day requirement. It has been imposed in the European Union, but it was only instituted, that requirement, in 2013. Well, the first genetically engineered food started coming on the market. The first one came on the market in 1994. And then a big rush of them came on the market in 1996, 1997. So look how many years it was before they finally imposed that regulation. A regulation that the FDA, the kind of testing that the FDA's own scientists had told the administrators was required not only by science, but by U.S. food safety law. So that's how irresponsible things have been and lax. And as we will discuss shortly, as my book discusses, 90 days is not long enough, it's clear.
Molecular biologist David Schubert, a professor and laboratory director at the Salk Institute of Biological Studies, has stated, "I've spoken with many molecular and plant biologists who are not directly involved in producing GE foods, and it's clear that most have been misled about the basic facts." Schubert also pointed out that some plant biologists are making statements about GE foods that they almost certainly know are not true. What do you think of his statements?
His statement is right on, unfortunately, and because far too many plant biologists and molecular biologists have been making statements that they almost certainly know are not true, is the reason that so many other scientists who do not understand the mechanics of genetic engineering, have not reviewed the research, are not aware of many of the studies, well-conducted studies that have detected harm to the laboratory animals that were unfortunate enough to have ended up in the experimental group rather than controlled group and were fed the GMOs. They don't understand that, so they don't know the facts about genetic engineering or the testing on it that has shown problems, and so they fall prey to the misrepresentations, and they are not well informed. Not because they are irresponsible themselves, but because scientists in whom they have a right to trust have been acting irresponsibly, speaking irresponsibly, writing irresponsibly. And this needs to be understood. Scientists need to understand the extent to which they've been hoodwinked by scientists and scientific institutions in whom they had a right to trust and who had a duty to accurately and honestly communicate the facts and to uphold all the other standards of science as well.
Bill Gates is known for being very smart.
Very smart.
And he's promoting GMOs very strongly. Why is he doing that?
I think he's doing it because he believes it's a good thing. You know, Bill Gates and his wife Melinda, who run the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, through their foundation have been promoting the development development of genetically engineered foods and the propagation of genetically engineered foods, especially in the Africa and third world countries, very, very strongly. And I think because they believe it is good, they believe the misinformation that they've been fed, that these foods are safe and that they're in line with science and that we need them to solve the world's food needs. I'm sure that they are very well intentioned in doing this. But I am also equally confident, I am sure actually, that if Bill and Melinda Gates, who are both brilliant individuals and very, very good computer programmers, I mean, they became one of the most, if not the most wealthiest couple in the world through computer programming. If they knew the extent to which not only genetically engineered foods not only violate sound scientific principles when analyzed from the standpoint of biological science, but how unsound this whole venture is when viewed from the standpoint of computer science and software engineering, they would very quickly reassess what they're doing, and I think they would scale it back and at minimum require that all of the genetically engineered foods that they're developing, that their foundation is developing, would go through rigorous safety testing. But I think they would probably stop altogether. And here's why, just in a nutshell. My book has a whole chapter devoted to the analysis of so-called genetic engineering from the standpoint of software engineering. It's titled Overlooked Lessons from Computer Science. Subtitle is The Inescapable Risks of Altering Complex Information Systems. And computer science has learned the hard way, that there are inescapable risks of altering any complex information system, even if the people altering the system are the people who wrote the system. Even if they devised the system, they understand all of its architecture. They understand all of the intended interactions of the various system components. Let me put it this way, they cannot make even what they presume and wish to be a surgically precise minor revision to the system to improve system safety and performance without imposing the risk that some other aspect of the system, some other way the system interacts, has been unintentionally disrupted in a way that could create harm. Okay? They've learned that there's no such thing as a precise surgical revision that doesn't entail the risk of unintended side effects. And that is why, when dealing with life-critical systems, those are information systems, software systems that govern how a pacemaker functions, or governs how a X-ray therapy machine functions, or serves as an airplane guidance system. Even after those software programs have gone through rigorous testing to get on the market in the first place, if the slightest revision has been made by the people who know the system backward and forward, supposedly, the FDA in the case of medical devices, or the FAA in the case of software guidance, airplane guidance system, they presume that the system is no longer stable and safe, and they require rigorous testing to be done to demonstrate that that change has not made a disruption in the system that could cause the loss of human life. And they will not accept any arguments of substantial equivalence, even though they should be quite justified in that case. We only made a little change. It's the same system, and we know what we're doing. We know the system, and we're making a change to improve it. The FDA, the FAA says you can't argue substantial equivalence with us on that one. You got to prove you haven't made a change. You haven't proved that an unintended disruption has not occurred that could cause the loss of human life. Nowhere near the same level of rigor of testing is required when the biggest, most complex, and yet least understood information systems on our planet are being changed not in a precise surgical way by scientists who understand the system well, but by scientists who didn't create the system, who only understand it in a very superficial way, and yet are making radical changes to it that we know have the potential for making unintended disruptions that could create toxicity or allergenicity. And what happens to the regulators at the FDA? They say, we presume you didn't make any change at all that was serious. You can market it without doing any testing. And what did the European Union do for years and years and years? They said, if you can show it's substantially equivalent based on superficial parameters, superficial criteria, we'll approve it. That's how crazy it is. So that's why I am confident that if Bill and Melinda Gates and any other software engineer were to actually read Chapter 11, hopefully the whole book, but at minimum Chapter 11, they would change their minds. That would change their minds. And as my brilliant and very witty wife said, when she read the first draft of that chapter, she said, your Chapter 11 can put Monsanto into Chapter 11. So, and for those of you who don't know, Chapter 11 is a form of bankruptcy.
Is genetic engineering more precise and predictable than traditional plant breeding?
When new varieties of crops are created through naturally available sexual reproductive pathways, then we have very good reason to believe, in fact we know, that there are some very precise processes that are going through that will maintain the integrity, genomic integrity of the species, while also introducing opportunities for genetic diversity, which the species needs in order to stay robust and healthy and stay well adapted to the environment. It's really sexual reproduction in plants and all higher organisms is an exquisitely beautiful process in which there's stability, maximized stability, along with flexibility and diversity. It's this beautiful play of stability of the species, of the genome of the species, of the genetic core of the species that defines the species is being maintained, while there's genetic variability. And as people just know who have brothers and sisters, we all, you came from the same parents as your brothers and your sister, but you're different. And even identical twins develop, their genes start developing differently anyway. But unless they're identical twins, there's going to be genetic diversity through the sexual reproduction, the process of sexual reproduction. But we also know there's exquisite orderliness. There's each parent contributes one set of genes, one set of chromosomes, one set of genes, and each chromosome is paired with a partner chromosome. A chromosome is a set of genes. And so that's when things are the way things are going right. So the same thing isn't happening in genetic engineering. You've got genes that have never been before in the species being haphazardly put into the DNA strand. That's the way to date, the genetic engineering procedures that have produced most of the genetically engineered foods on the market have been they acted in a haphazard way. There was no way to control where in the DNA strand the inserted DNA went, and disruptions were being caused. Several documented disruptions ordinarily occur at the insertion point and also throughout the genome. Scientists who have studied the insertion process and its effects have dubbed that process genome scrambling because it scrambles things up. There's a lot of changes going on. Similar disruptions do not happen in traditional breeding. And this is an important point. It's orderly process, and even the National Academy of Science report in 2004 that claimed that genetic engineering did not entail higher risks, they have a chart which clearly shows that the propensity for unintended perturbations, for unintended effects in traditional breeding through naturally available sexual pathways is very tiny, very small potential for unintended disruptions. And yet, when they show on the chart the modes of genetic engineering through which most crops on the market have been produced, many times longer bar on that bar graph, they acknowledged a much greater propensity of genetic engineering to create unexpected and unintended perturbations, changes in the organism. And yet they claim that the risks are the same. And they could only do that by actually illogic and surreptitiously changing the very definition of risk. My book goes into that. There's a chapter explaining how that report has filled with flaws. I won't go into it now, but I've demonstrated, and good scientists who've read my book and reviewed the book have stated the demonstration of the surreptitious misrepresentation of the very technical term of risk has been demonstrated. So just know, even though the National Academy of Science, the committee that produced that report, they had to admit, they had to acknowledge the clear fact that traditional breeding, pollen-based breeding, has very little risk of creating unintended disruptions, unintended side effects compared to genetic engineering, and yet they claim that genetic engineering does not entail higher risks, but only did it by a lot of subterfuge, and one of the greatest subterfuges was actually altering the technical definition of risk, which they had adhered to when it came in reports on topics other than GMOs. When it came to GMOs, their three previous reports also surreptitiously changed the definition of risk in order to argue that genetic engineering doesn't entail a higher level. It's really astounding, and that's been done by the United States' premier scientific organization, done in the name of science, and has hoodwinked hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And because of such hoodwinking that has gone on by the National Academy of Science year after year, report after report, hundreds of thousands of people have been exposed to high-risk foods. Never should have happened.
What was the Seralini Study? And if you could tell us about that and why it's important.
The Seralini Study was one of the most important studies done to date. And it's a study that if it had not been viciously attacked and misrepresented, if the facts about that study had been clearly transmitted to the press and then from the press to the public, again, the whole venture to genetically engineered food would be in its death spiral, if not already dead. That study was performed in 2012. It was performed earlier. It was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal in 2012. And it was a very, very well-designed study and a long overdue study because it was a long-term study. There have been very few long-term studies conducted by independent scientists independent of industry influence on a genetically engineered food. And they were, Seralini, he wasn't the only scientist conducting it. He was working with a team of university researchers in Europe, many of them at the University of Caen, some in the United Kingdom. There might have been a few other countries involved. But they had noticed that a disturbing trend in the studies that had been done on genetically engineered food, even when there had been some feeding studies done, and that was actually the minority of the cases, there had been statistically significant differences that were dismissed by the researchers as scientifically insignificant, not biologically significant, and or changes that were troubling, that were nearing the level of statistical significance, but changes especially troubling in liver, signs that could have been the precursors of liver and kidney toxicity. And that's important, as the researchers emphasized, because the livers and the kidneys are the basic. They help screen toxins out of our body. They have to, if we're ingesting toxins, especially in a chronic way, day after day, month after month, the livers and the kidneys are basically there to defend against them, but they can be strained and stressed because of that. And so signs of liver and kidney stress and toxicity are worrying and should be paid attention to. They've been dismissed as biologically insignificant. So through 90-day tests, in fact, Monsanto had done a 90-day test on one of their most widely planted varieties of corn, technically called NK603, which is in the food supply in a big way. And by the way, corn, for people who may be listening to this in other countries, you would be calling it maize. Here in the United States, we refer to it as corn, but maize is more the agricultural name, technical name. So Monsanto had conducted a 90-day test on this variety of maize. It had been genetically engineered to be resistant, tolerant to the Roundup herbicide that Monsanto sells, glyphosate being the active ingredient. So Monsanto had done the test, and in reviewing the Monsanto test data, these researchers had again noticed there were some troubling signs to the kidneys and to the livers of the test animals that Monsanto had dismissed as being not biologically significant. So they wanted to repeat the study, but do it for 2 years, long term, to see, because they felt these signs were precursors of problems that might manifest through the long term. And after all, human beings have been eating GMOs long term. And certainly little kids, small kids that started eating GMOs in 1996 and have been eating them repeatedly and are now not little kids anymore, that's been long term. They wanted to study what happens when you take very young rats and feed them through 2 years, which is a long-term cycle for a rat. And that hadn't been done before, at least not with that variety of GMO, that NK603. They wanted to study it. But they designed their study, they followed through with, they replicated Monsanto's study in the respects that was important, using the same strain of laboratory rat, the same strain of GMO corn, but they made it even more rigorous. Besides doing it for 2 years, they decided to test not only the genetically engineered corn that had been sprayed with Roundup, as it would be sprayed under normal agricultural conditions, they also tested corn that had not been sprayed at all, the genetically engineered corn that had not been sprayed, to see if there was something problematic in the genetic engineering process itself or in the specific gene that had been used. They also tested the Roundup separately from the corn to see if there was a problem with Roundup independent of the corn. So there were 3 basic experimental groups: rats that were fed the genetically engineered corn that had been sprayed with Roundup under normal field conditions, the genetically engineered corn that had not been sprayed, and the component of the spray, the Roundup, independent of the corn, just added to the rats' drinking water in the typical dose they would have received if they'd been ingesting the genetically engineered corn that had been sprayed. And what they found was, over a 2-year term, statistically significant signs of liver toxicity and kidney toxicity that were not just precursors of it, but the real thing. They found toxicity had been caused to the liver and the kidneys, and also in some cases to other organs, but those definitely were showing it. And all 3 categories of experimental animals, those that didn't eat the corn at all and only a small dose of glyphosate, those that ate the corn without the Roundup, and those that ate the corn that was sprayed with Roundup, they all showed toxicity. Very, very powerful. Now, they also found that there was an unusual incidence of growth of tumors in the experimental rats. And because in a toxicity study, any tumors that are detected are supposed to be reported. So they reported them. But it was not a carcinogenicity study, it was a toxicity study. They reported the toxic results. They also reported the tumors they observed, because that is according to the protocol. Now, when that study passed peer review, got published, and unsurprisingly, Monsanto orchestrated a major attack against it. and Monsanto wanted to be operating behind the scenes. So they got some of the scientists that they can usually get to front for them and to write letters to the editor of the journal, to write papers attacking it, opinion pieces. And so there's this concerted attack from pro-GMO scientists who were in league with Monsanto. So at least 140 scientists, independent of that influence, wrote a letter, open letter, I believe it was an open letter, certainly a document stating that it was a sound study and that they agreed it was a sound study. So there's this back and forth attacks, other scientists saying, no, it's a good study. Eventually, after months and months of sustained attack on the journal, pressure applied to the journal editor, and the appointment to the editorial board of a former Monsanto scientist, then eventually there was a retraction because the Monsanto and the scientists working with it were pressuring for retraction. They finally retracted it. But here's an interesting fact. The retraction didn't follow the standard guidelines for retraction. The reasons that the journal's editor gave did not fit the criteria that are supposed to be the only criteria justifying retraction of a paper from a scientific journal. So once that was pointed out, he had to try to come up with another reason. But the reason he gave was inconclusive results, but of the tumor data, not of the toxicity data. Now, and here's an important point. In fact, when the journal editor retracted the study, he acknowledged that the results of the toxicity study were accurate, were valid, were reliable. He only focused on and I shouldn't even say carcinogenicity, because the researchers never said anything about cancer. They just reported the tumors. They didn't study them to see if they were cancerous or benign. So he accused the researchers in the retraction of unjustifiably stating that genetic engineering could run the risk of cancer. They hadn't even mentioned cancer, and he said those results were inconclusive. So inconclusivity is not valid grounds for retracting study. What happened then is the pro-GMO scientists, not just those who were in league with Monsanto, but even the National Academy of Science, the British Royal Society, in their reports, when they talk about the Seralini study, they don't mention the validity, the reliability of the toxic results, toxicology results. They focus on the tumors and say those results were inconclusive. And in fact, now because it was a solid study, it was republished in another peer-reviewed scientific journal a few years later. Now, the Royal Society, when it mentioned that study briefly, it just mentioned it had been retracted. Didn't mention it had been republished, even though its report came out a few years after it had been republished. That's fraud. The study was republished. All they did was they cited that it was retracted without citing it was republished. That's the Royal Society of the UK, the world's oldest, most respected scientific organization, behaving as if it were in league with Monsanto. And I have no evidence, and I don't mean to imply that Monsanto has been in any way paying off the Royal Society. They didn't need to, because those scientists, unfortunately enough of them, are so psychologically, ideologically wedded to genetic engineering, they go to bat for the likes of Monsanto and DuPont without even having to be pushed, because they are trying to protect the image of genetic engineering, because they have become somehow convinced in themselves that genetic engineering equates with science. And if anybody criticizes GMOs, they're criticizing science. That's ridiculous. Genetic engineering is a technology. It's applied science, and it's not even being applied well. It's not science applied well. And but But it's very important to understand. And the National Academy of Science, their 2016 report, when they claimed there was no evidence of GMOs ever creating any harm to any animal. Well, how did they handle the Seralini 2-year study? They played the game that everybody else is playing. They focused only on the tumor results. They said they were inconclusive. They did this whole analysis of the tumor results, and they completely brushed aside the valid toxicological studies. If you read that report, anybody who reads it would not even know there were valid toxicological studies in the Seralini study. And I've actually had a meeting with the chairman of the committee that wrote that report and brought that point to him and kept driving that home, and he still basically is claiming, no, we did a good job, we acted responsibly. The Mexican Academy of Science, they also did the same thing. In a book they published promoting GMOs, they talked about Seralini and how what an inconclusive study, and you would not ever know that the editor of the journal acknowledged there were reliable toxicological study findings. And yet in Mexico, which relies on maize, on corn, far more than any other country in the world, and scientists have found out that the Mexican food supply, corn supply in the greater Mexican City area, the corn flour, the tortillas, and there's one other ingredient that's commonly used, they're all contaminated with that MK603. That if the scientific community had acted responsibly, wouldn't be in any food supply. And yet here's the Mexican Academy of Science claiming that it's upholding science, allowing that contamination to continue because they say that corn is safe. And they cite the Seralini study as a bogus study, as a bad study, and that's what's going on in the name of science. It's really astounding. It's really astounding. And the Mexican Academy of Science is aware of my critique, of the critiques that have been made. I've brought that to their attention. They know about the critiques showing that the toxicological results were valid. It was a valid toxicological study. They will not change their tune. They continue to claim Seralini study is a bad study, and they continue to promote GMOs. And it's just astounding what's going on in the name of science.
Can you sum up everything we talked about here today in 15 seconds?
Genetically engineered foods are on the market only because the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has covered up the warnings of its own scientists about their unique risks and lied about the facts and broken U.S. food safety law. Important pillars of the scientific establishment, including eminent professors at leading universities and eminent institutions such as the UK Royal Society and the US National Academy of Science, have not upheld science, have actually allowed disseminated misinformation in the name of science, and have sullied the standards of science, sullied their own integrity. If the FDA had told the truth, and if all the pillars of the scientific community had communicated the facts fairly and accurately, genetically engineered foods would not be on the market anywhere. And the tremendous resources that have been directed to them would have been redirected to very safe and sustainable and healthful modes of farming.
What's the one thing I need to do today?
In regard to genetically engineered foods, I would say decide that you and your family are no longer going to eat these abnormally risky foods, and read labels, get educated, and be informed, because I've been avoiding GMOs for many years, and I'm very healthy and vigorous, and you don't have to sacrifice anything except risky foods.
Why did you feel it was important to come here and speak at the Real Truth About Health conference?
Well, because as the name implies, this conference is interested in the real truth, and it allows people like me who understand truths that have been distorted to have a good forum to speak and then to widely disseminate the facts. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And I had spoken at a conference in 2015, and I was delighted to be invited to come again. And I'll be delighted to come in future years as well, because this conference is doing a great service to the world. And I was very happy to hear that the subscribers to the YouTube channel have been growing, accelerating, and I think that's great, because we need to get the public, not just here in North America, but around the world, informed about the hazards, the risks of genetically engineered foods, and the risks of pesticides, and so many other things that are happening that are endangering the health of people in this world. And they have to be, because really it's only through informed consumers that major changes are going to happen. As I mentioned earlier in this interview, GMOs are off the market primarily fundamentally in the European Union, not because of the good graces of the responsible attitude of the European Commission and the European Food Safety Association. It's only because the European media back in the late 90s reported some research that showed problems, and the public became concerned, and they made it clear to the food manufacturers, and especially the food distributors, the stores, we're not going to buy this stuff. And that's why these foods are labeled well in Europe and off the market. And that's why they're on the market in the US, because the media has not reported it, and the public has been bamboozled.
If people want to learn more about your work, where should they go?
They should look for my book, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth: How the Venture to Genetically Engineer Our Food has Subverted Science, Corrupted Government, and Systematically Deceived the Public, a book for which Jane Goodall wrote the foreword, and she has hailed it as, without doubt, one of the most important books of the last 50 years. They can also go to the website of the Alliance for Biointegrity, the organization I founded and direct, www.biointegrity.org, biointegrity.org. Those would be two very good ways. There's a lot of good information on that website, and there will be more in coming months.